Welcome. Today's webinar from CompetencyWorks is to take a look at an introduction to K-12 competency-based education. CompetencyWorks.org is a website with resources on competency-based education, including lessons learned, implementation advice, case studies from across districts, schools, and the field. It looks at both policy and practice. So in getting started today, on the lower left-hand corner of your screen is a chat room, and we encourage you to engage in a conversation. Please introduce yourselves, where you're from, your school or district, and any interest in competency-based ed. We will be doing questions and answers throughout, so please type in your questions in that chat room and we'll facilitate a conversation. This webinar will be archived and there'll be a link available and the slides will be available to you. So let's take an overview of our learning goals for today. These are the questions we will seek to address. If you have other questions, again, please enter them in the chat room. We'll be taking a look at what is competency-based education, the relationship with personalized learning, how it's advancing across the country, and a quick look at the policies that help enable competency-based systems. So first, let's take a look at the working definition for competency-based education. There are 5 elements, and critical is that students are advancing upon demonstrated mastery, and that demonstration is a performance of what students know and can be able to do. The second part of the definition looks at explicit, measurable, and transferable learning objectives. And those learning outcomes include competencies that include academic knowledge, but also skills and dispositions, those habits of success and broader core competencies. It's important to note that assessment in a competency-based system signals to a student powerfully whether they've learned or not. It's a positive learning experience for students, and students are getting immediate feedback and support along the way. So the question of why competency-based education, why do we need to change the system of learning? We are seeing districts and schools across the country turn to competency-based education for a number of reasons. Now, if you go to other countries and look at their K-12 education systems and ask someone, a student who is entering high school, what level they're in, they have mastery-based systems. They are giving supports to students on those competencies and learning objectives and making sure that they are on grade level. And in our system in the U.S., we have time as a constant, age-based, grade-based cohorts, and learning as the variable. So this focus on competency-based ed from a systems level is for a number of reasons. We want to be moved to a system of education that is equitable, that is globally competitive, that is focused on deeper learning and deeper learning opportunities, so it's personalized, and ensuring that all students learn. So this idea of changing to a system that's competency-based, focused on equity and support, is critical. So some districts just really want to get started. They're leaning in, they understand the flaws of the current system, and it's about doing what's best for kids. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Sturgis. Chris.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. So let's just talk about the traditional system. We've found that it really helps to understand mastery-based learning or competency-based learning or proficiency-based learning, whatever you call it, when you understand why the traditional system isn't doing what we need it to do. And it's not as if it's all wrong. It's just that there's some flaws because it wasn't designed to make sure that all kids could be fully prepared with a full set of skills that they need for their future. It was developed at a very different time in history. So let's look at these, there are 10 flaws. So first, it was really focused on a narrow set of academic outcomes. Remember, ABCs, 1 through 3s, and we've got our Common Core or the state standards, and we've got different types of academic standards now, but it's still pretty narrow, and we'll talk about how we have an expanded system in a bit when we think about a competency-based system. It also has a fixed mindset orientation. Now, a fixed mindset and a growth mindset are psychological mindsets identified by Carol Dweck. But this orientation that some students are smart and some are not quite as smart actually debilitates our schools, because there's no sense of efficacy if you don't think you can help kids really achieve at high levels. So that fixed mindset gets in our way. The traditional system also tends to be very top-down, bureaucratic, and hierarchical. It's been really organized around efficiency and compliance, and it makes it very hard for schools and teachers to respond to student needs. One of the characteristics of the traditional system that really has led to and reproduces inequity is the high levels of variability. There are some teachers that are considered the hard teacher, and there are other easy teachers. But the hard teacher actually had higher expectations for us in school. And then what you also find is that one school will have different set of expectations of what it means to be proficient compared to another school in a district, and districts will have different expectations. And that has become a problem, which actually No Child Left Behind was developed to help to respond to. Now, this is the issue of the opaque learning objectives and performance expectations is highly related to this variability. But students don't actually know what they're supposed to be learning. And so it becomes very hard to focus in on how do I learn better, what do I need to do if you're not really clear, because the A through F grading and the assignment grade books, right, you got an A on this paper. Well, what am I supposed to do? Or a B on this paper, what am I supposed to do differently to get an A? So it's always been very opaque. So there are a few more to talk about. The traditional system uses academic grading practices that send out mixed messages and misleading signals. And here's the situation. Why is the situation that students may be getting A's in high school but have to take remediation in college? What's that problem? Well, that's because they thought they were doing everything right, but we were sending the message they didn't have to work any harder, but they really did. We often talk about the traditional system being time-based, so students advance based on how much time, a whole semester or a whole year, no matter if they learned what they needed to. And that is a practice that gets in our way as well. The grading systems often depend on extrinsic motivation. Remember all those points? Well, the point system is the idea that students are going to put out their best effort in order to be able to get more points. Now, that works pretty well for high-performing kids, but it doesn't work so well when you already have low points or you have a 0 in your grade book for some reason, and you can't ever actually get that many points and succeed. So it works for some kids, but not for all. Part of the problem with the traditional system is it targets extra supports when students are academically or behavioral kind of identified above or below the norm. So special education students are able to access extra supports, hopefully, and gifted and talented students have programs, but anybody else, has to kind of advocate for themselves to get extra support unless you fail, at which point you might be able to get a few more extra supports. And then the traditional system really emphasizes the assessment for summative purposes. It actually verifies what students know, not what they learned. And that's been a real problem. And then, of course, the one-size-fits-all assessment could actually be considered ethically challenged because why should a student and why should we spend money on having students take tests if we know that they're not proficient at that level? So those are some of the flaws, and there are others, and it's worth thinking about. And it's also it's important to remember that fixed mindset and the culture of a bureaucratic culture can undermine even the best competency-based model. So you really want to think about how you change that culture. So let's move on to what is competency-based education and what isn't it. And I want to take a second to talk about what it isn't. So it's not just one or two teachers doing it in a classroom by themselves. We really believe that it needs a school-wide structure, and we'll talk about why that is. And it is not simply a digital or adaptive curriculum with students moving on at self-paced. That is not what competency-based education is about. We're going to talk about all the richness of it. And it's not zipping through a curriculum at low levels of the depth of knowledge, at memorization, and only comprehension. Competency-based education does have a quality, competencies, that really expects students to be able to transfer what they've been learning to new and challenging contexts. And that really is the applied learning and the deeper learning. And also, finally, I want to say, one other point, which is there is also competency-based education going on in higher education. And at the highest levels, when you look at the definitions, they're very similar. But many of the competency-based programs in colleges are designed as options that are offered to some students to develop marketable or workforce skills. But in K-12, our commitment is to 100% of the kids and preparing them for the skills they need to be successful in life, college, and in career. So I want to make that distinction. So now I'm going to talk about these 10 distinguishing features of competency-based education, and they're organized in 3 different sections. One is around the purpose and the culture. So the first one really is, instead of narrow academic outcomes, it's a much broader sense of what student success looks like. And it's the academic knowledge. It definitely includes all the academic knowledge. But it also focuses on the transferable skills, the ability to apply your skills. And then, and this is a place that gets very powerful, it really focuses in on lifelong learning skills. And those are the skills that students need to be able to manage their learning. And it includes a growth mindset. It includes social emotional skills such as self-regulation. And it includes traits like perseverance. The second is districts and schools make this commitment to be responsible for all students mastering learning expectations. You can actually think of this as internal accountability. It is saying we are going to keep changing our school until we make sure that every kid is learning. And one of the principles of a strong mastery-based school describes it as we're not done innovating until all kids are graduating. And that's the culture that is very important in the school. Districts and schools nurture empowering, inclusive cultures of learning. Instead of hierarchical and bureaucratic, it's much more responsive. It wants to make sure that students and adults feel that they belong and are valued. And why this is important is related to the science of learning, because feeling safe is actually a very, very important part of students and adults feeling like they can take a risk and try to do something that they might not know how to do. So don't think this is just soft ideas. These are rooted in the science of learning. Now, when we start to talk about pedagogy, there is not one instructional model for competency-based education. The primary goal is to use what is going to work for students. But there are a couple things that you're going to see in high quality competency-based systems. So the first is that students do receive timely and differentiated instruction and support. All students do. And the best way of doing this is providing some type of flex time, personalized learning time, they're called different things each day, that students can go either work with the teachers that they want to get help from, or teachers can actually sign up students to come work with them to get that extra help when they need it, so that they're not lost and confused for several days or weeks or even months. They get the help when they need it. Second, it's informed, it's research informed, it's informed by the sciences of learning. And we emphasize meeting students where they are and building intrinsic motivation. So meeting students where they are is about thinking about the zone of proximal development. And it's not about tracking students, but it is about flexible grouping and making sure they get exactly what they need to be able to keep progressing. And a lot of that is about repairing the gaps. And this goes back to that issue of making a commitment to all students. It's about saying, stop, I've got a student in my classroom and they're missing some of their skill sets from 3 years ago, and we're going to fix this right now. Because just imagine they're going to be passed on and trying to learn when they don't have the skills to learn. And the assessments are really embedded in the learning cycle and aligned to those outcomes that we talked about expanded outcomes. And so this is much more formative assessment. There's a much stronger emphasis on this. And there's a very strong emphasis on teachers developing their assessment literacy and their skill at giving effective formative feedback. But it's also about lifting up those and including performance-based assessment so that students are learning and demonstrating learning at the higher end of the Bloom's taxonomy. And finally, there are some structural pieces that are changes from the traditional system. So one, instead of a high level of variation, there are mechanisms in place to ensure consistency of what when teachers determine a student is proficient. And these processes called moderation and calibration of the grading are very important. And it's a missing piece out of America's school systems in general. And so it's really teachers sitting together with student work and agreeing on what proficiency is. And the moderation practices and processes should be eventually developed across schools and across districts. In New Hampshire, the PACE initiative did several things, but one of them was creating the moderation and calibration processes. Another one is transparency of the learning expectations, what it means to be proficient, and also transparency about how students are progressing. We aren't just going to monitor our students on grade level or not. What we want to do is make sure that they're actually growing and progressing wherever they are in their process. And so that's a difference from the traditional system. The transparency cannot be underestimated about how powerful it is in terms of empowering students to be able to take responsibility for their education and for creating conversations for teachers to be able to have honest conversations and with their administrators about what's going on and what is needed in order for students to be able to get the support they need. Fourth one, the strategies for communicating progress and support. Support the learning process and student success. Okay, shorthand, this is grading. And people turn to changes in grading way too soon, and they lose control of the narrative, and it becomes all about why are we changing this grading practice rather than why aren't we changing our schools to be the very best they can be for our children so they get the supports they need. And so what you want is to be able to thinking about this is that grading is really a technique for communicating progress. And then finally, in the definition Susan shared, the first one talks about advancement based on mastery. Well, what we've discovered over the past 7 years is, in fact, this is a culminating feature of competency-based education. When you have all the other ones in place, this becomes very natural that students really demonstrate what they're learning, they continue to keep learning and continue to get supports until they're proficient, and that those pathways are going to be somewhat personalized because kids enter classrooms at different places. They may take more time to repair gaps. They may have some aptitudes that allow them to fly. All of that is good as long as the students are progressing. So I'm now going to turn this back to Susan, who's going to talk about the relationship of competency-based education and personalized learning, and then we're going to stop for questions. So please put any questions in the chat room.
Great, thanks, Chris. And there are a couple of good questions coming in that we'll get to facilitating during that Q&A time. So let's take a look at what is this relationship between competency-based education and personalized learning. And iNACOL, in partnership with over 1,000 educators across the field working in schools on personalized learning, developed this, I would say, field-based definition about personalized learning. It's really about each person, each student. Personalized learning is about an approach that helps tailor those learning experiences, including enabling voice and choice in how they meet these learning targets. So in a competency-based system, you have clear and explicit learning objectives. You have students working on these objectives through personalized pathways. And it provides flexibility, but also support to ensure that students reach mastery of a common set of high standards. So we're holding the standards consistent to ensure equity for all students. So when we think about personalization and competency-based education, you might say they go hand in hand. It's really critical that the culture of a competency-based system, which is a set of values, Chris just described these important elements, are the roots. I think of it as a structural foundation. And that the distinguishing features of this competency-based ed system from the pedagogy, from the structures, from the system itself are the common elements that make up the trunk and branches. Without competency-based ed as a fundamental structure, personalization itself may result in variable achievement and have concerns around equity. So for personalization per person to really thrive and work towards excellence and equity, you need a competency-based education structure. And on the other hand, a competency-based structure that is still teaching one size fits all to students without personalization will unlikely to be reaching high outcomes for all students. So if you think about this tree, the leaves on the tree are these personalized approaches and instructional strategies. Well, students are able, with those key learning targets, move through, get the supports, but also take per person personalized pathways tailored to their interests, needs, and passions. All right, so with that, let's pause for a moment and go to Q&A. Chris, I had a first question that came in from Sarah from Vermont, asks about the differences between K through 6 and 7 through 12 competency-based education. So essentially between elementary and secondary. She says there are a lot of secondary models in Vermont, but she's curious how this happens and what it looks like in practice at the elementary level.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I'm going to expand on this a little bit to, as a foundation for one of the other questions as well. So the concepts really are exactly the same. Younger students, right, are going to be more, they want to please the adults. They're going to listen to the teacher more. They don't need as much intrinsic motivation to put forward their full effort. But in fact, intrinsic motivation can still be very important, but you don't have to think about that quite as heavily. But what I want to say is I'm going to describe a classroom of a personalized competency-based classroom because they look very much the same for elementary, middle school, and high school. When I walk in, as the students walk in, they know what they're going to work on usually. Possibly the teacher brings everybody together and reorients them for the day, but a lot of times students know if they're going to be sitting near the teacher's table, they know what project they were working on yesterday, and they go and they get going. It's possible if there was a full class activity of some sort that there might be some type of quick formative assessment to kind of do a check-in and reorient students. It depends. And some classes are very much all the students are working together on the same set of activities and instruction, and sometimes it's much more personalized. But regardless, they really know what they're supposed to be doing. And there are usually reminders called standard operating procedures of some sort on the walls, or some type of way for them to be tracking their progress and what they were working on in case they get confused. So that's one of the things that happens. The shift, the students are taking much more responsibility for the learning and allowing the teachers then to work much more in small groups and individually, usually in small groups with people. So I think that's one of the changes you have to understand. I have been in, and I'll give you just an example of a first grader. I walked in, they were the ambassador for the day, met me at the door. and they showed me how they were learning to count to 100 and the different types of activities they did to do that. And they had choices about how they were going to demonstrate to their teacher, and this student wanted to use the blue jewels, a little box with 100 blue little beads in them, to be able to show. And the student said, yeah, I get mixed up around 60 every time, so I have to keep practicing. So the student was very clear on what the task was, what the challenge was able to access help when they needed it. And that was elementary school. I've seen a couple middle schools that are using much more interdisciplinary, very much class-oriented big projects. But what the teacher is doing is monitoring how the student is doing in terms of demonstrating their proficiency and monitoring how long they're spending on something, so they know if the student hasn't come forward, because it's middle school, hasn't come forward and said, I need extra help, they're kind of keeping an eye on that. So what you're hearing is a lot of this is based on, it helps a lot to have a strong information management system that's student-centered, and you know how students are, not just on grade level standards, but actually how they're doing on their own trajectory. As you get to high school, the students have more, it's going to be intrinsic motivation is going to be more important. Often their peer groups are very, very important. So some schools really create a very strong community of learners. If you read up on Casco Bay, on CompetencyWorks, they really believe in taking advantage of that strong peer culture to create communities of learners. So the kids are helping each other. I would say one of the biggest challenge for the high schools is when we're not doing competency-based education at the elementary school levels. That is when this issue, the kids are being passed on with gaps, and they're reaching high school, and they're coming into 9th grade with 3rd, 4th, 5th grade reading and math skills, or with gaps in them. And that challenge is so draining on the high schools that any district that wants to become competency-based, it's fine to start with the high schools, but boy, I would get your elementary schools going. And you know what? It's not that big a change from a high-quality elementary school either. I mean, the elementary school teachers will be like, oh yeah, I know how this works.
Yeah, Chris,
okay, Susan?
Yep, just about a minute too, and you addressed some of this question. Joan asked, is there an assumption that teachers have in-classroom support for when they have to stop the instruction to the group in order to retrace for an individual student or two? And I think part of what I heard in your answer too is that the models themselves in competency-based education lend themselves when there are clear learning objectives and these capacity matrices. So every student is at maybe a slightly different place, but they're getting supports when they need it. You see students working together. I was just up in British Columbia, and I saw we had a guest on the webinar today from BC, so welcome. And they have really unpacked subjects away from the way we think about courses and subjects here, most of the time, to a full range of learning objectives and progressions so that the core competencies go across all of the academic knowledge, and that the core academic knowledge is broken apart. There are subject domains, but those competencies of core academic knowledge also can be brought together in interdisciplinary projects, and then you're showing what you know in like project-based learning and deeper learning assignments in a different way. So this assumption that teachers have in-classroom support, can you comment on that?
Yes, and Jerry Dreyer just noted this in the chat room as well. You're not going to see 50-minute periods of teachers providing direct instruction. That's not what you're going to see. You'll see maybe 15 minutes of the teacher bringing all the kids together for some direct instruction, possibly, depending on the classrooms. But the sciences of learning says students have to be, they have to be active learners. So the idea that somebody's imparting knowledge to me is not aligned. So the sage on the stage actually is not aligned with the science of learning. So there may be some direct instruction, but then the students are going to get involved with some kind of activity or project or be working on something where they're learning, struggling with the ideas, a lot of productive struggle, and then the teacher is walking around and doing very quick, rapid, using observation or conversations with the teachers, formative feedback, and trying to understand where the student may have some misconceptions. When they identify 4 or 5 students that all have the same misconception, they're going to group them very quickly to try to bring that together. So what does this mean? It means that the teachers have to really understand the instruction for different academic domains. And they need to understand it not just for one grade level, but for 2 or 3 maybe. Because they're now using, they're using their own expertise. They're not delivering a curriculum. And I'll just wrap this up by saying teachers will repeatedly, who throw themselves into this and give it a whirl and try, will say, this is why I came to teaching. This has given me so much satisfaction. I am so challenged by it, but I am learning, and this is why I came to teaching. And they feel very, very strong about that. Okay, we're going to have another Q&A in a little bit, so keep them going. But now we're going to just talk a little bit about what we've been learning over the past 7 years. These are very high level. We're learning so much. So one of them, when we look at how competency-based schools vary across, I'm not convinced that we have a whole lot of different models as much as we have developmental stages of understanding and putting the ideas together. And one of them is which skills and how much the school is focusing on skills. So there are schools like the Young Women's Leadership Academy that has organized their entire set of learning experiences, their curriculum, around 10 sets of skills. But there are other schools that are still very, very content focused, where they're covering content and it's still pretty low levels, depth of knowledge. But I don't think that that's intentionally where they want to be. It's just one of the variations. Now, we are seeing more conversation around multi-age grouping. And there is research that is very mixed about whether multi-age grouping is effective or not. But that is all based on multi-age grouping within traditional systems. So it's hard to know whether or not that's giving us a clear picture. But here's what's powerful about the multi-age groupings, and this is like 1st and 2nd grade together, right, or 9th and 10th, is it helps the teachers shift away from the idea of covering the curriculum or covering the standards to meeting students where they are. Because if you're serving both 1st and 2nd graders, you can't just be delivering the content. You're really starting to focus in on where are kids and what do they need to move to the next step. How much and how schools are organizing opportunities for deeper and applied learning varies a fair amount. For a while, people were trying to have level 4, there'd be level 3 was reaching proficiency, and a score of 4 was an applied level. And the problem with that is that when you're trying to do that for every standard, you're not really capturing the challenging part of applying learning, which is to decide which skills and knowledge you're going to use to solve a problem. So schools are using, some of them are using intersessions or a week around big project-based learning. Some have deeper learning go through everything, but some schools have moved to block schedules so that there's more time for activities and projects. It really varies about how that's getting built in. Meeting students where they are really varies. There are some schools, Building 21 in North Philly and Kettle Moraine and Waukesha STEM are all using what I described as a learner framework, where they're not thinking as much, they're paying attention, but they're organizing the learning about where the students are in their own learning journey and tracking that very carefully. And then there are schools that are focused very heavily on delivering grade level standards. And then there's kind of a mix. And that tends to be a bit about how much the teachers are empowered and expected to meet kids where they are. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't repair gaps, kids get stuck and can't really move on. So you can cover the standards as much as you want, but if they don't understand fractions, they're going to have a very difficult time with algebra, right? So there's a logic to this which says take the time. If they can learn it, then they can move on. How they communicate progress, this is the grading issue. Some schools just use A through F grading all the way through. Some are using a hybrid. They're not quite ready to give up those extrinsic points for good behavior or turning things in on time. And then there are some schools that have said, no, we are going to just use a scoring system that reinforces the science of learning, reinforces the idea that school is about learning and every student is learning where they are along their own learning trajectory. And then this issue of internal accountability and continuous improvement, how much schools are really willing to have a candid conversation with their parents about your student has been in our school system for 7 years, but they're actually, at 5th grade level, even though we're in 7th grade, and we are going to correct that situation. We're going to have that conversation, and we're going to make a difference. That's a hard conversation. Some schools are willing to have it, some are not. And I would say we're pretty far. There's only a few schools that I've been able to find that usually really use the continuous improvement processes developed through total quality management, where you're looking at processes and trying to figure out which ones are the best and address the ones that aren't working as well. In terms of implementation, when we first started, most of the districts were working off the model developed by the Reinventing Schools Coalition that's now part of Marzano Research Labs. And pretty much everybody was using these 4 stages of ramping up. Then they would design this infrastructure for learning. They'd decide what the competencies and standards were and develop the rubrics. Then they would transition, and then they would start to do continuous improvement. It's different now. We have a lot of schools entering the world of competency-based education from very different entry points. They may have implemented technology and blended learning. They may have emphasized project-based learning for the past 2 years or the growth mindset, and they're starting from different places. But here's a couple of the lessons learned. A lot of people want to pilot with just a few teachers, and that's probably okay, except that it's very easy to isolate those pilots. And we really recommend that there's a commitment from the school and or the district and school board first before you start to pilot, so that everybody knows this is the direction we're going, and we're going to pilot it and we're going to learn, but we are going in this direction. People then pay a lot more attention. It's hard to do, but if you're going to start to move towards personalized competency-based education, it looks to us, and this is very anecdotal, that those schools that take the time to review the sciences of learning, to create a shared kind of set of pedagogical principles about how they think students learn and the role for teachers, seem to be able to implement everything much more easily. When you're just discovering your pedagogy after you've implemented, it's a very rich and robust time for teacher learning, but it does seem to take longer, we think. Not sure, but it's worth paying attention to that. Investing in laying a foundation for the building blocks for learning, again, that's the growth mindset, social emotional skills, perseverance, seems to make a difference. Again, it's very similar to the clarifying the pedagogy, but if you do that, then the students can take more responsibility for their learning and everything falls into place better. There's been some feedback that people have been implementing technology too early. And the technology ranges from digital curriculum to their information management systems. But there is some thought that clarifying your model and how it works and getting some of the pieces in place and then saying, how can we use technology to help us, is helpful. The problem is if you implement too early, or let's say you implemented blended learning before you start really thinking about mastery-based learning, is that some of the pieces get bureaucratized and kind of concretized within the school system because of the technology. And now all of a sudden you've got kind of a rigid system that may not be able to, you'll have to spend more time undoing and redoing your technology. And finally, as quickly as you can, get to a point where you're walking the talk, so that the same concepts and values of competency-based education and personalized learning are used for adults. That seems to make a huge difference. Okay, I don't know why our Q&A pictures aren't coming up, but I think that's a Q&A, right? It is.
Yeah, it is, Chris. And we've got a great question from John DeWalt. In the CBE system at the secondary level, are you seeing enrichment through the competencies somewhat maintaining that 8-semester experience, or have you seen acceleration in early graduation? And I'll take a first stab at that and tip it over to you. But at the CBE system at the secondary level, if students are moving ahead and accelerating, in high school, Diploma Plus, others, what we're seeing is students want to graduate with their peers, so they stay in high school, but the schools are creating more experiences, both inside and outside of school, like additional AP courses, dual enrollment, place-based learning opportunities, internships with deeper learning projects, and projects connected to the community so that they're still graduating with peers. We're not seeing a lot of students moving on in early graduation. Chris, did you want to comment on that too? Yeah,
I think that's right. It's unclear to me why this is, but we don't see as many districts trying to kind of take the lid off of learning. And we don't want to get caught into a faster is better orientation, right? Because that's not what learning is about. In fact, learning, going deeper and really rich learning experience is what we probably, that should be what we're striving for. So there is one school I went to where the kids, there was a group of students who wanted out of high school as fast as they could, and they were taking advantage of a mastery-based approach to do that. And they were, according to the principal, students who had been experiencing a fair amount of domestic violence, either with their boyfriends or from their family, and they wanted out of the communities. And so they were trying to graduate and get to college and get out. That was the one place where there was like 5 or 6 students that were really focused on acceleration. But I do think we need to think more strategically about what it means to take the lid off and allow kids to be able to learn at the higher levels. I mean, we want to make sure that we're helping kids who have gaps, but it's equally important to allow kids who are at grade level to keep learning above grade level. And I think that's a challenge for us in the future. Great. Well, we'll stay on track for timing. I don't have any other questions right now, and move to the next subject, which is how is competency-based education advancing across the country? So let's take a look at state policy and how that's been advancing. When Chris and I started to work together, we put together this map of the United States in 2012, and you'll see there are a handful of states that have policy to help support and enable competency-based education. The yellow states are states that had waivers, so they have some permissions that they had dealt with in state policy to have seat time waivers to allow competency-based pathways. The developing states, and you might think of this as state policy on a competency-based continuum. The green states are really providing blanket flexibility for seat time. We don't think waivers are the greatest state policy because it requires the state to have a bureaucratic process of approving and disapproving waivers on an annual basis. So many states are not doing waivers, but moving straight to broader flexibility for defining credits in terms of competencies and not seat time, which is a good thing. The burnt orange states have what we would call advanced policy. So in Iowa, they created a competency-based task force. They addressed policy needs and legislation after that task force, had recommendations, created a pilot for schools and a professional learning community. And you're really seeing states get more and more interested in that advanced policy and the role of state support to districts and schools, especially with regard to professional learning communities. And in New Hampshire, which may be the most advanced state,
A lot of the New England states, Maine has a proficiency-based diploma and others, but in New Hampshire, they have moved to defining all credits in terms of competencies and have a statewide program for performance assessment called PACE, or Performance Assessment for Competency Education. Now, take a look at this map, 2012, and we're going to go to the next one, which is 2018. Look at the change in the country on how competency-based education is advancing. So you have more states advancing policy which gives flexibility from seat time to districts and schools. We're seeing the growth of interest in both policy and practice, but just because you have enabling policy and flexibility now doesn't mean that implementations are taking hold in practice statewide. So that's a real issue that needs addressing. In practice, we need to continue to support high-quality implementations, and right now, most districts, they're still getting started. So what policies are helping to enable competency-based education? You see that states that want to help districts get started, help work with districts and schools ready to move in personalized learning and competency-based education are trying to build capacity for performance assessments and build those calibration processes across the state. We're seeing an interest because of that, an interest in new systems of accountability, although the early state plans are not quite there. We're mostly seeing these last two bullets, which are pilots for competency-based education and space for innovation. So if you look across the U.S., right now you have states taking on profile of a graduate work, which is really important to identify what is the purpose of education and can we have more holistic definitions of student success. We see pilots in Nevada, Oregon, Iowa, Ohio, Idaho, Florida, and South Carolina, so that's exciting. Innovation zones are enabling policies in Connecticut, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Rhode Island. Proficiency-based diplomas in Arizona, there's a Grand Canyon diploma. You have Colorado, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont with proficiency-based diplomas, Rhode Island, and expanded learning opportunities in Colorado and New Hampshire with a driver. So there are a number of states that are exploring what are their entry points for enabling competency-based education. And of course, with New Hampshire's PACE program and an assessments for learning project that's working in 10 different states. In fact, Louisiana has a high school English language arts pilot for performance-based assessment, and Virginia's Assessments for Learning project is working on performance assessments statewide. So you get a sense of the policy and the entry points to create personalized competency-based systems here, and I'm happy to take any questions. So here is our next pause for questions. Chris, were there any questions coming up? Chris, is your mic on?
Oh, yes it is. Oh, that was weird. Okay, sorry. There was one question about how the CBE schedule impacts elective courses, specifically in secondary school. Do you want me to handle that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So scheduling is hard for sure. There are two things that you really want to make sure are in the schedule. And if you don't have these two, it's hard to make it work. And one is actually professional learning communities for teachers. There needs to be time to learn, plan, talk to themselves, and grow themselves. And so that's super important. And then these flex hours. And there's lots of different models about how people do that. I think I have not heard as a problem that there's trade-offs on the electives. I know there was a comment in the chat room about the concern by putting a flex hour, sometimes that ends up being a pullout from other either core courses or from electives. And I would say that a high-quality competency-based system wants to make sure that kids are not always doing just remedial, that those flex hours are often used for enrichment and more challenging, deeper learning as well. And that's an important part if you're just thinking about the sciences of learning and what's engaging and motivating a student. You're going to want to make sure that they have both going on. I have not heard of any problem about elective courses, but there is a desire, what we do see is kind of more block scheduling, fewer kind of course time, because we're not worrying about the instructional time anymore, right? Or hopefully we're not. Some state policies are still doing that. But we're thinking about how do we most help the student learn. And that becomes a different mix of things. And so that's where people are starting to change. I've seen some schools that give Friday as a real flex day for kids to work on what is most inspiring and important to them. So a lot of elective courses can get built into that as well. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but it's not been something that's come up through our site visits as actually a problem. But I do think the 50-minute schedule is a problem.
Yeah, Chris, if I can just weigh in there on this idea of secondary schools and how, what that means for electives like music and art. I was just visiting a secondary school up in Vermont, Winooski, and what they've done is they have, again, it's open block scheduling, but there's a learning lab. And the learning lab allows students to go in and if they're digging in deep on math or a science project, there was one particular student who was describing how 2 years before, and he was a sophomore, he had been really interested in airplanes. And so he developed this whole project around learning about airplanes, and it had gotten into some engineering concepts. And because it was a competency-based school, he was mapping out both the math and the science, and kind of the STEM, which may or may not have been in state standards, but allowing him to go deep on his love of airplanes. And what he was building in this learning lab at the time was a whole project around drones, and it was his day of reflection. So he was reflecting on the learning goals he had set out on this project around drones. He was building a drone with CAD software and a 3D printer, and he was using a number of different techniques. There was also a music studio in this learning lab, and it was connected to an art studio. So while students were building these projects that may have been related to social studies or government or math or science, the students that love art were bringing the art learning objectives and standards and developing these projects and reflecting on how they were, again, Vermont has proficiency-based diplomas, how they were covering those different standards and competencies that they would need in their proficiency-based diploma through these really beautiful artistic projects that would be interdisciplinary to again, earn those credits and competencies towards graduation.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm going to take a second because we're just a little bit early, and I want to just, Jerry's been writing some pieces in here. Just to make sure that the folks who are totally new to this and haven't had the chance to see it, and you've just explained kind of one of the things you might see in a competency-based school, this issue about there are things that are different, that if you don't understand that they're different, it's hard to imagine how it works. And one of them is that by organizing and thinking carefully about how to motivate and engage students, that students are putting forth their best effort. And then if you help them build those building blocks for learning, they could actually manage themselves at much higher levels. I mean, at some levels, it's kind of accelerating maturity is one way of thinking about it. So now you've got mature students wanting to learn. They're coming in hungry for learning. That classroom's different. The kids are on task almost the entire time. So much more learning is happening in that time. And I think that's one of the important things to remember. The second is the kids can help each other. a lot of times. If there's little issues, hey, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, the kids know the standard operating procedures are you don't bug the teacher because the teacher's doing this very specialized job of helping other kids learn or helping me learn. And that formative feedback and helping address misconceptions and providing those kind of nudges and helping kids really struggle with something until they can crack it open and get it, is really, that becomes a kind of I would almost call it like sacred space within the classroom, which is that people protect that and that becomes very important. And then the third is because everything's transparent and the kids know what they're working on. They know what it looks like to become proficient. They have options about how they learn and how they demonstrate their learning. That also changes those classroom dynamics a lot. And again, what becomes important for the teacher is to really understand what proficiency looks like and be consistent in scoring it. And then making sure that kids actually revise the work. And the revision process becomes so important in competency-based ed, and that really hasn't come through in this conversation yet. But you don't just get a B on a paper. You get scored on it, and the student needs to go back and revise it and demonstrate that they learned and could do it at the levels of whatever 7th grade writing is or whatever the task was to be able to have a strong opening paragraph, right? But they're going to keep working till they get it and they can demonstrate it. And they're going to be able to do it next time most likely then as well. And so there's these changes, and that's how it becomes personalized in the classroom without the teachers being just overwrought with trying to respond to 30 kids' needs all at one time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to
just real quick on that point. I think you said something that was really important, and it's pointing to the teacher is absolutely essential in this model. I was in a high school, and there was a big sign up, and it said assessment is always open. And so if you have a student doing the work, if you think about like the Apple Store, there's a Genius Bar. There's like a Genius Bar in this high school classroom, and the teacher's like, oh, when you're ready to be assessed on the work that you're doing, assessment's always open. And so they're scoring, or they're saying, you know, essentially like A, B, or try again and come back, and here's what you're missing. That it's all part of this learning process, but the teacher is absolutely essential, and that professional judgment is really important on the scoring and the calibration of student work.
I'm going to just respond quickly to Colleen's comment or question about are there kids who struggle with this model. At first, in high schools, you may get pushback from kids who are high achieving who want to have their A's. They're extrinsically motivated. It takes them a while to develop an intrinsic motivation. But it's interesting, which is that there's a whole group of private schools that are now moving towards mastery or competency-based education because they're actually worried the kids are not developing enough of a sense of purpose to their lives, and it hurts them later on in college. And so this ends up being a very important piece. And there is a group, I think, that does struggle, and those are people who are really having very chaotic lives who probably need more structure, like an alternative school, smaller classrooms. It's not the mastery-based learning that's the problem. They just need more adult support during hard times. Okay, so I'm going to quickly say there's a webinar series coming up. This was the first of it. Lovers and Logic Models is the next on June 19th, 2 to 3 Eastern Time. You can find registration at INICL or at CompetencyWorks. And if you have any other, oops, that one in the wrong place, Susan. Oh, there we go. If you have any questions, you can email myself or Susan at these emails, and we would be happy to help you or direct you to other resources. And just want to thank everybody for participating. Thanks, Ashley, for getting us ready, and thanks, Susan, for everything. Have a good day, y'all.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Thanks to all, and we'll look forward to having you join our future webinars. Take care. Bye-bye.